Quest 2, Level 4. This begins with a poem from a woman named George. The poem is Where I'm From by George Ella Lyon, and it is possible, perhaps even likely, that somewhere along your schooling career you have read this poem and you've written your own Where I'm From poem, because it's a very popular activity with English teachers. And you know what? That's okay. I am not going to ask you to write your own Where I'm From poem. Instead, I want you to think about how George Ella Lyon was able to look back on decades of her life, or more specifically anyway, the decade of her youth, and narrow down the list of things in her life at that time that were important to the ones that make it into this poem. How did she decide on the particular foods or the particular places or the particular relatives, the particular moments that she comes back to in this poem? Because those are the ones that are super important to her, right? She's not going to write about all the forgettable stuff. She's not going to write about the stuff that didn't make an impression on her. She is making some determination in her memory of which are important to her identity and which are not. And at this point, you are probably sick of hearing the words culture and identity and the phrase cultural identity, but I don't think we're done exploring it. So 2 more Crash Course videos, this time Crash Course Philosophy, that are about identity. What makes you you? One starts with the question of what makes Batman Batman? Is it just the cape, or is it the man inside the cape? And then an additional elaboration on how we can think about personal identity for ourselves. Following those videos, there are 3 more TED Talks about preserving culture and preserving different aspects of culture. So is the most important part of your culture in the monuments and the objects, or is the most important part of your culture in something more intangible? So 3 different people are talking about different parts of culture that are important to them and what they are trying to do to preserve that culture and to try to share that culture with other people. And then there's, we're going into the Springboard book again, this time to Unit 4, for a 1-paragraph excerpt from a novel called White Teeth by an author named Zadie Smith. And believe it or not, this 1 paragraph says so much about how we as people think about our identities and about what's really important in those identities. And the reason why I'm asking you to think about that all the way through this, what is really important to identity? What do we look back on in our memories and say, this is the person I want to name, this is the food that brings back these memories, this is the place that was most significant to me? How do we make those decisions? Because when you sit down to write your narrative in Level 5, you are going to bring a cultural perspective to that narrative, and you are going to have to think about what parts of my culture are important enough to me that I want to put them into this narrative. The end of the level, there is no writing. The end of the level, you sit down and have a conference with me where we talk about exactly that. So you've had all of this time now to think about why storytelling is important in general, why telling my story is going to be important, because you don't want anybody else telling the story. That's the danger of a single story. You've taken a look at all of these different kinds of ways to tell a story, and now you have considered the things about yourself that are important enough that you might want to put them into your story. So we're going to have that conference, we're going to have that conversation, and when we're done with this level, you are going to be ready to go into Level 5 to write your narrative, knowing exactly what you want to do. But let's take a look at the rubric for Level 4. There's a literature standard and a media literacy standard, and both of these are really, again, this should be kind of a familiar refrain at this point. These are about making sure that you understand the ideas that were presented in the literary texts and in the video text, and that you can find evidence from those to back up what you're trying to say about them. But I want to talk about the discussion, the speaking and listening standard here, because this is our first time getting this standard. I was very well prepared for my conference with Mr. Bullock, having considered my own cultural identity, whether to tell a true or invented story, and which genres I would be comfortable in. If you sit down across from me at the writing conference table and you say, yeah, I finished level 4, and I say, okay, what are you thinking about for your narrative? And you say, this is not going to go well for you. The whole point of all of this buildup is so that you can get to level 5. You can get to the point where you're writing your narrative, the embedded assessment, the most important part, the most significant part, the biggest part in terms of the standards for this quest. The whole point is that you should be well prepared at this moment, at the conclusion of level 4, to go into level 5. And so if you sit down and you have nothing to say, if you just are a shruggy guy, you are not going to score well on this standard, because the whole point is that you have stuff to talk about. Anyway, good luck.